So, when an incident involves multiple organizations, we may assign more deputies from an organization so that we can have some increased interagency coordination, all right? That's a scenario where that may be necessary or something that's going to assist us when we do that. In the planning section, if you think about an incident that's liable to take several days to resolve, several weeks to resolve, it becomes real critical that we start tracking and this IAP you heard reference to becomes a real important document, because what we do today is going to be different than we did 4 days ago on an incident like that. It's going to be different than what we're likely to do 4 days from now, all right? And so documentation on a large expanding incident becomes real critical. And so preparing and tracking the incident action plan, that's a major responsibility of the planning section. Collecting, evaluating, displaying incident intelligence. What do we mean by incident intelligence? What kind of information on a disaster site would fit that category? Would we want to have a number, if we had, let's use our tornado scenario again. At some point, very quickly, are we going to try to make a determination of the number of properties involved? How many homes were destroyed? How many had major damage? How many had minor damage, and so on? Well, we can consider that part of a disaster intelligence package, all right? What's the scope and magnitude of the effects of the disaster? We want to track resources assigned to the incident. You heard earlier that although it's a logistics function, we're actually tracking resources within planning, because obviously how well we're going to accomplish those objectives, one of the main criteria is going to be, do we have sufficient resources on site to actually meet the needs and make the necessary adjustments to do proper resource assignment. We want to maintain incident documentation. How about that IAP I just talked about? Wouldn't that be a very key piece of documentation on a disaster site? It would be, all right? And then finally, I think Matt mentioned this earlier, developing plans for demobilization, meaning as quickly as we ramped up the resources we're going to put on the scene to manage our event, at some point we want to start doing a demobilization plan. Who's leaving first? If we've got all kinds of different resources being provided, what are we going to be able to part with first? All right, if we've got identical resources working a scene, one's voluntary asset, one has a paid asset, which one likely would be demobilized first? So those are some of the considerations that we'd have to make in our demobilization plan. Again, all these functions occur within the planning section, within the ICS structure. So, if we have a full-blown incident, major disaster, within planning we can actually establish a number of units within the planning section. And so, if for example, on a practical basis, if I was told we want you to go work as a situation unit leader on a disaster, let's say that our disaster is going to be out in the state of Kansas, and I'm here in the state of Illinois. Is there a key there within the structure of ICS that tells me what a situation unit leader would do in the state of Kansas? Would I have anything to go on? Within the structure of ICS, one of the beauties of ICS is that we have descriptions for these various positions pre-established, all right? So that if I know on a disaster site, I'm assuming the role of a unit, situation unit leader, I have a general idea because I have some assets, I have some resources that I can turn to that tell me what a situation unit leader is responsible for. Does that make sense? All right. And so I know, for example, if I'm in that position, who am I going to be reporting to? Who's my boss going to be? Who do I, before I ever get there, I know who I'm going to be working for, don't I? I'm going to be working for the planning section chief, right? And so in a full-blown incident, then we can have all of these units, or maybe even some technical specialists are going to provide some information to us. Is weather ever a real important factor that I want to factor into my planning? If I've got a number of activities I anticipate doing tomorrow, is it weather going to be one of the paramount things, of whether it's going to, there's going to be the ability to move forward and accomplish things, because obviously the weather can have some detrimental effect. All right, let's move on to logistics. Major activities within the logistics section: ordering, obtaining, maintaining, accounting for essential personnel, equipment, and supplies. All right, all the stuff required to make things better has to be procured through the logistics section. You heard already, providing communications, planning, and resources. We can't overemphasize communications in a good day is so difficult. In a disaster site, effective communications becomes real critical, and there's a whole lot of obstacles to seeing it done well, and so we try to overcome some of those, all right? Setting up food service for responders obviously is very critical function, especially again on a large protracted incident. That's going to be real critical. That's done through logistics section. The maintaining and setup and shutdown of incident facilities on a scene is the responsibility of the logistics section. Anybody remember from the video earlier this morning some of the names of facilities we talked about on a disaster site? Remember any of them? We talked about an incident command post. It's likely where these 8 positions within the leadership of ICS are going to be located. We talked about things like bases and camps and different things. And so logistics is responsible for that. Providing support transportation. On a practical sense, if I have a disaster site, let's say my footprint of my disaster site is a 6-block radius in a certain area. All the responders that are being asked to come perform some function, well, we don't want their personal vehicles necessarily, real close to the site or to staging or whatever. So we may rely on some type of support transportation. We may use buses to get people into an area. If we've got a very large remote area, that may become real important that we do something like that. And then finally, providing medical services for injured personnel is a logistics function. Here I'm talking about folks on a disaster scene working under the umbrella of the incident command system where they would get some type of medical assistance. Or what's the plan if I injure somebody on the disaster scene that's doing work? Where are they going to go receive medical treatment, whether it be major treatment or minor, and so on. Not to be confused with any medical plan for the general public, the victims of the disaster, not the same thing is what I'm trying to say. This is the plan for responders. And then finally, our finance administration section, responsible for contract negotiations. Again, think of a major disaster, long-term. Let's say again, we go back and use the scenario of a river flood. What's one of the things, the tools we use to fight river floods? What do you see people doing out on the levees? Sandbagging, all right? Somebody's got to procure all those sandbags, right? So it's probably going to take some contract. Well, this is the kind of thing, if we don't have these assets readily available, we'd see our finance administration section being responsible for. So contract negotiation and monitoring those contracts and so on. Timekeeping, I think Matt referenced this earlier. If you're being paid in your position, obviously you have to keep track of your time that's being devoted to disaster response and so on. And so we would have folks that would be responsible for timekeeping. How about cost analysis? I used the example a while ago that we got 2 identical widgets that are solving our problem on a disaster site, but one of them is being brought in on a volunteer basis. The other one is getting paid for their service, all right? Who keeps track of those kinds of things? Who's analyzing what the cost impact is on our disaster scene? The last thing we want on a disaster scene is some very expensive piece of equipment not being utilized, all right? But it's costing us every day because we contracted for it. It may be costing us a considerable sum. We might have a situation where we have to compensate for injuries or damage to property. In the course of the activities of our responders. Let's say the fire department, destroys some piece of property, has an auto accident, whatever it might be. There may be a claim that has to be processed for both damage or injury and so on. And so that would be a responsibility, a major activity within our finance administration section. And then finally, documentation for reimbursement. The system we have in this country today is that if a disaster is big enough, large enough, expensive enough, there is a mechanism, a means that we may seek some reimbursement under a process of a disaster declaration where we seek federal dollars to come back to a community to help offset the cost of the disaster. So there's a whole lot of, obviously, major administration and finance that goes into tracking that kind of an activity. All right, and so again, key functions within ICS. So, any question about any of these 8 positions we talked about?
Which group would be, because I see contract negotiation, what group is going to get these volunteer groups in on the bottom? Who's going to be asked?
Get them in. It's going to be based on the needs within operation. Are you performing some critical function? Do you have a resource that's going to help solve a problem? All right. Now, somewhere in the negotiation, the finance section chief is going to find that out and may deal more directly with your organization to the mechanism of how we're getting you in there. Are we reimbursing for whatever? All right, that's where that would be done. But ultimately, it's going to be based on the needs within the operation, going way back to what are the objectives of the incident commander today. All right. And so if we need that resource to accomplish the objectives, and the operations section determines that my strategy is to utilize that kind of resource, that's what would get it put in play. All right, does that make sense? Again, within a full-blown finance section, we can have something called a procurement unit, time unit, cost unit, compensation claims. Is it not pretty clear just from the titles of these positions what they'd individually be responsible for? And so again, it goes back to the whole business of trying to use a common terminology within ICS so that everybody has a pretty clear understanding of what different responsibilities are. So now we talked about complex incidents, expanding incidents, multi-jurisdictional, multi-incident period events. We could have a full-blown ICS organizational component with all of the various elements within ICS, the command staff, the general staff, and all the support units staffed, and now it gets to be a pretty complex chart, doesn't it? All right? But if we follow a few simple rules, can we do this in an effective way that people are safe? They know what their responsibility is. They know who in their organization they report to, and so on. And so this is how you can wind up with hundreds or thousands of people actually working on a disaster site and still follow the structure, the integrity of ICS and have everybody accountable. Because ultimately, we want that personal accountability, all right? And so how we do it, there can be some variations in how we organize, and I think Keith's going to talk about that a bit more after lunch. He's going to show you some examples of how you might fit in to the structure of an ICS response. But this is the whole purpose, is that we can bring some type of organization to a very chaotic situation. Because would you grant me that disasters are chaotic? It's tough enough to get things better, to make things better in an organized fashion, but you add the chaos component, and if we do this, hopefully, we've now put in place a structure that things are going to get better. We hope quicker, less expensive, less downtime, less people injured, and so on, if we follow these rules in the structure of ICS. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is a concept called unified command. Not to be confused with unity of command and so on, but I think this will become real apparent. There can be there could be a situation where we can have an organization that consists of the incident commander from various jurisdictions or organizations operating together to form a single command structure. And here's an example where they show fire rescue, local law enforcement, hazmat folks on an incident site. Could you envision a scenario where more than one organization may be calling the shots? Where it might not just be a single incident commander. Let's think about a couple of scenarios. Let's say today, somewhere in Illinois, a train runs off the track and it's hauling some type of radioactive material on board that train. And there's a fire that's engulfing a couple of tank cars and something like that. Where would we go to make a determination of just what is that hazard? We would probably have to look for somebody who had some expertise in working around radioactive material, wouldn't we? But would that particular person necessarily have expertise in how to evacuate a 10-block area? All right, so now we may have a situation where law enforcement or a fire department, with the addition of an expert in matters radiation, collectively come up with a single set of objectives and manage that event. Why? Because we may have the need to call upon people with various degrees of expertise from different categories of response. Does that make sense? All right, look at a civil unrest. Let's look at a scenario. We've got civil unrest in a major city. Let's say that as a component of that unrest, we've got folks setting fires. Now, we've got perhaps a situation where we've got fires raging, a traditional fire department response, but you add the component and it's being done in a fashion where, let's say our fire department personnel may not be safe because of the complexities of what's been occurring, arson, whatever it might be. Would we then see a scenario where maybe the law enforcement leadership and fire leadership are collectively determining where we go fight, how we're doing it, and so on, because it makes more sense to bring those expertises together. And so those are just a couple of examples where we may institute something called unified command, all right? Still working off a single set of objectives, but we've got other players coming together based upon what their responsibility is, what their authority is, what their expertise is. A shared understanding of priorities and restrictions, hopefully, all right? If we're going to have let me stop right here. For something like this to work, what kind of leadership is it going to take? What would some of the key components of the leadership be? Would you have to have someone who works well with others in a leadership role, right? So hopefully that we're talking about people that could work collaboratively, all right? Again, we want to decide a single set of objectives, whatever the action is that we're taking to provide some strategy to make things better. We want to hopefully have improved internal and external information flow, less duplication of efforts, better resource utilization. So those are some of the keys we would be looking to if we were going to try to implement unified command. Am I losing you, or are we clear on this concept? All right. Probably more useful tool in a complex, type of a disaster scenario. So again, we still have a single integrated incident organization, meaning we still have operations. We may have planning, finance, logistics, and so on, but it's just the way that we bring in the leadership within ICS. We can be co-located, use shared facilities. Again, operate on one set of incident objectives, a single planning process that leads to a single incident action plan, all right? We integrate general staff, only one operations section chief, all right, still within the organization. But we want to have a coordinated process for resource ordering. That can be a factor. We may be doing something called multi-point ordering as opposed to single resource ordering. I think we used an example earlier today about going to one location for ordering resources. But this is what that can wind up looking like as far as the structure of what this can be. Unified command, maybe it's hazmat commander, maybe it's a law enforcement incident commander, might be public works. Again, it depends upon the nature of the incident, the nature of the hazard, the nature of the event. What's the risk that we're trying to mitigate? Unified incident objectives, meaning collectively everybody agreed what had to be done, all right? And then we could still then have a single safety public information liaison and so on. Again, one of the keys for this to work is people have to have a degree of trust and understanding. Would there be some exercise activity perhaps beneficial to trying to see the kinks worked out of an operation like this ahead of time? If we were going to try to implement unified command, hopefully we'd have that luxury. So making it work, again, including key community response personnel. So who would the key leadership be? They're going to have to buy into this type of a system. Making sure that first responders know their legal and ethical responsibilities. All right? I don't know if we've talked about this yet, but if I'm the incident commander on a scene, am I operating on my own authority? Whose authority am I operating under? The local government, all right? And so I'm acting on behalf, aren't I, of that local government leadership, whether it be a county board chairman, a mayor, township supervisor, whatever it might be. I'm operating, I'm responsible to that person, all right? They're the ones that gave me the authority, delegated the authority to me to operate on their behalf. All right, so making sure that first responders know that, their ethical responsibilities. What kind of ethics are involved on a disaster scene? Yes. We do unfortunately see that. We see theft occur. Sometimes, unfortunately, responders take advantage of a situation. We have scenarios where people try to misrepresent themselves as being part of an organization, of a structure within an ICS structure. And that can be a problem. And so we certainly have ethical considerations to think of. Any major disaster occurs around this country, it's a big one, FEMA's been involved, money comes back as a reimbursement process. We see those cases where people find ways to misuse those funds, and so that leads to those kinds of problems. Isn't it beneficial that if anybody going to try to make this work, that they have an understanding of ICS, all right? And so we would expect all the key leadership in this scenario to do their homework and attend classes like this and know what their responsibilities are in ICS. And then finally, like I said a while ago, training and exercising together, because what we're ultimately trying to do here every day is be better prepared for the next one, aren't we? And one of the key components of preparedness is individual training, it's developing plans, it's understanding if we've got equipment we're working with and so on, that we know how to utilize those tools, where one of the big tools today is ICS, understanding the structure of the incident command system. So, coordinating incident activities, the kinds of activities we may be talking about is establishing a set of policies of how we're going to operate, how we're going to collect information that we deem to be critical, establishing priorities. What are our priorities going to be? Hopefully, you were listening this morning. What did we decide already is paramount on a disaster site? What's our top priority? Safety, yeah. So the life safety issues are paramount, aren't they? All right, we're going to stabilize the scene and then ultimately, hopefully, preserve property. And so that helps an incident commander that's trying to organize and do the right thing and get these things accomplished. Those are some of the rules that he or she knows in the back of her head are going to guide them. We may have a situation where we have to resolve resource support issues. We want to facilitate support and then synchronize our public message through the use of our joint information system. A joint information center is it's a facility that I want to talk about before we're done, just real quickly so you have an understanding. If we have a disaster strike, it's a no warning disaster. Let's say it's a major earthquake occurs in Illinois, just like that. All right, the media is going to have immediate need to do what? Try to gather information. What do we know about victims? What do we know about the impact area and so on? Well, if I'm part of an incident command system that's making those determinations, doing that disaster intelligence and so on, I become very important, don't I, to the media, because I've got critical information that they want. If it's critical enough, the media will come to me, all right? And so they'll come to a public information officer who might establish something called a Joint Information Center. Again, you think about the delegations of authority. If I've got 100 media representatives trying to talk to a single PIO, am I going to have, if I'm the PIO, do I have time to do 100 interviews? No. And so what I want to do probably is collectively announce to the media that I'm setting up something called a Joint Information Center. You come here at 2 o'clock this afternoon, you're going to get a briefing on what's occurred. We're going to give you the best information that we have to this point and so on. And so we see that established on major disasters today, something called a JIC. So it can be established to coordinate public information activities. It serves then as the central point of contact for all the news media. Do we want it in the middle of the chaos? No, but we want it somewhere near the disaster site, don't we? All right, and so this issue of media relations, the media has something important to say to people affected and unaffected by the disaster. I've got critical information. If I'm a incident commander, I want people to stay out of a certain area for their own safety, for example. And so I need the media to help convey that kind of information. And so it's a partnership. And so it's effective use of a Joint Information Center is something that becomes real critical in doing that. So with that, any questions about any of that? We ran through some of that real quickly, but I think it is lunchtime. Is that correct? Oh, we're hoping. Well, we're going to break anyway, whether it's lunchtime or not. So, all right, we'll find out. Thank you.